Okay, so welcome to everybody at Teams Fest 2020. My session is about rolling out Microsoft Teams for a collaboration in a global organization. So this is a real-world scenario in which I've been working with a renewable energy company for the last 7-8 months in helping them to roll out Microsoft Teams. So this session is very informative. It's basically my version of events in terms of sharing my knowledge, the nuggets of information, some examples, so that in your journey, wherever you are in your project, hopefully you can take away some of the experiences that I've kind of gone through. So let's get started on that. Just before we go into that, a bit about myself. I'm Chirag Patel. I work with Patel Consulting, so I'm an independent consultant, specializing mainly with Microsoft 365 technology stack. And for the last 15 odd years, I've primarily worked with the SQL Server as well as SharePoint, both on premises and online. And over the last couple of years, obviously being morphed into Microsoft Teams. And so I kind of work with a variety of projects from deployments to migrations, as well as adoption and change management elements of it as well. And so, there's my details. My handle is generally at Chirag for both Twitter, LinkedIn, and the blog, which these days mainly I tend to just put my speaking engagements on that. As part of the do my day-to-day work, anytime that I get, I tend to volunteer to speak out at community events, mainly around Microsoft tech, and some of the names you see here that might be familiar to you. I've kind of spoken to most of those events, and also I'm speaking a couple of events next week as well. So really, kind of the opportunity for me is generally deliver on what I've learned, what I've kind of experienced, but also in events such as these, being able to also learn from others too, because it's just constantly ever-changing game. And I think that's kind of the message, if you like, that's always been dotted out all the time. So feel free to check out my slides if they're of any benefit to you. And for this particular session, the organizers will make the recording as well as the slides available to you as well in a few days. Okay, so in terms of the agenda, what we're going to go through is essentially just a brief profile for this organization in terms of the rollout approach with some plans, as well as some of the considerations around what kind of plans, what kind of sessions we planned to understand Microsoft Teams in its entirety, as well as being able to put some governance in place, and also be able to work with the various departments and business units in order to go through those workshops. But also the opportunity as well to upgrade from Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams, as Skype for Business upgrade. It's Skype for Business retiring essentially next year. So that's kind of what we set out to achieve in this session. So even though it's a global organization, not many thousands of users, so very much small to medium-sized enterprise, but nevertheless far reach in pretty much every continent, based in 10 countries, all the way from US to Australia. And so the company that I worked with, which is the renewable energy, and they basically specialize in solar energy farms. So right from the design, manufacturing, all the way to financing of these solar farms around the world for various organizations and so on. And so projects pretty much is what they do, various types of projects such as development, constructions, operations, so a variety of types of projects, from small to really large scale projects. And really kind of, if you like, Microsoft Teams was kind of almost on the agenda, in the sense that being able to bring a lot of these users, their staff, employees, dotted around various parts of the geography. So as a company, they're about 8 years old, and they started out from half a dozen people all the way to what they are right now, which is 500. But these are some of the drivers, if you like, in terms of why they wanted to roll out Microsoft Teams, only because they truly want to become a global organization. Being in 10 countries does not necessarily mean that they're truly global, but they need some kind of a standardization of processes, being able to also work with homogeneous technologies, because they've got a number of technologies in the company. But the main one there is basically literally from the CEO, that they need to encourage collaboration, and collaboration comes in variety of flavors and in variety of practices, and Microsoft Teams for them seemed the right kind of candidate solution for it in order to make this happen. And so, together with other drivers, is to somehow reduce some of the third-party tools that they had as well. So for conferencing, as well as other chats and so on. So in terms of the kind of a rough technology estate, what they had is essentially like 4 vendor solutions there. One of the solutions they had purely just for the soft phones, messaging, instant messaging, and so forth, as well as having another solution just purely for external calls to parties and so forth. So they kind of used a number of different types of technologies to do different things, when in actual fact, any one of those solutions, whether it's A or B, could have achieved the more or less the same set of requirements, and especially when you look at from Microsoft Teams perspective, then obviously not only calls, chats, meetings, they simply had no real idea which technology to use for what. And then obviously they had Skype for Business only because they had the Microsoft Office deployed, and also other aspects of Microsoft 365 services. The main one there, of course, is they used to have SharePoint, but they actually migrated from SharePoint onto another third-party solution to manage and store their documents as a knowledge repository. So truly completely off the rail, if I can say that, and really different pockets of tech doing everything. So this was a golden opportunity for them to somehow bring some of this together. Before we kind of went any further,
oh yeah,
I think somebody just come online. Maybe they can mute themselves. That'd be great. Thanks. So before we kind of went any further with this, in terms of understanding truly the teams, it was important for them, not just from the management perspective, but also from their IT, that Microsoft Teams has got a number of services that's kind of attached to it, predominantly SharePoint, inclusive of OneDrive as well. So their personal chats and personal files kind of get stored in their OneDrive, whereas team chats and files, team-related channel files and all those reside in SharePoint. But also things like Stream for Microsoft Team recordings, and also the calendar information. So this was kind of, if you like, for them to, as an eye-opener, that they're getting into something slightly bigger than what they thought, that is just Microsoft Teams. So it's kind of worth underlining that if you do roll out, then do take into account of those services. But like with everything else, in terms of the team that they had, was very small team. No real kind of, if you like, project manager, no architects, no developers, very tightly constrained IT team. So I myself was there as a main Microsoft consultant, kind of wearing multiple hats, from a delivery management as well as deploying the platform, configuration of it, and also being the trainer for it. So for me, the kind of bare minimum step one was understand really what their Microsoft 365 looks like from a configurations point of view, because there were no design documents or anything like that. So I kind of put together, and you can see the sample of the spreadsheet there, just kind of really documenting those configurations values from not just within the whole of Microsoft 365, but also the specific service workloads such as SharePoint, Teams, Yammer, and so forth, because this is what they already had switched on pretty much all the services. And so, obviously to my amazement there is that you had about 2 million files, and, it's like, what are these SharePoint sites? There were already 100 Microsoft Teams with no real naming convention, and so forth. So it was a kind of if you like, almost a month's kind of exercise together with discovery as well as documenting it and discussions around that. And then we were pretty much in a good place to start as to how we want to proceed further with Microsoft Teams. You may be familiar with this diagram, which is something from Microsoft in terms of how they kind of recommend to roll out Teams. Absolutely, for some organizations, Big Bang is probably an approach that they might take. We didn't. The main focus for us was essentially bringing the people together, get them connected, and also get them to work with Microsoft Teams closer with collaboration of co-authoring the files and documents around that. And that was kind of, if you like, the overarching aim to be able to use Microsoft Teams for collaboration purposes. As Microsoft kind of always recommends around, just start in small steps, experiment, and that's pretty much the approach that we took as well, because there was just purely so much to take on, and obviously not by any stretch to transform the organization in the space of, say, 3 months, but certainly to be able to plot out some of the specific use case scenarios, which we will take a look later on, in order to drive and also the engagement for people to realize that they better pay attention to Microsoft Teams, because that's where all the productivity gains are kind of happening. So we kind of started with the approach of training on Teams to the champions, which is what we kind of created, and also the general users before we kind of go further within the Microsoft Teams. I don't know about you, but I certainly get confused very quickly around the conversations when especially if you're new to Teams, and this has obviously been kind of going on for some time. But for me, this is kind of comes into 5 pockets, because new users, especially these organizations, they were very new to it, and whilst they used to, say, WhatsApp and other kind of third-party technologies, for me it was kind of really a simpler way to just point them out that there are one-to-one chats and group chats. If you have a project-based team chat workspace, then you have conversations in that pocket, as well as being able to then fire up your tabs and connect different services, pages, or third-party apps. Then you can have your conversations around that. So it was a bit more than a chat for them, but in the way to structure it out so that they know exactly where they were in Microsoft Teams when they're having those meaningful conversations, depending on where they are. So this was kind of, if you like, some time to spend just to demonstrate that how the chats and conversations worked before we kind of went further into developing any particular Microsoft Teams chat spaces. So this is the plan from Microsoft on their resources, and I have got at the end of the slides all the links that I've used, and more importantly, I've tailored those links that I have. So this was kind of if you like, the based phase plan, if you like, from rolling out Teams. So essentially, I'll pick out a couple of things in there, which is kind of more importantly from a technical stance, is making sure the right machines, the software versions, everything else was at the same baseline, but also preparing the IT help desk, training them not just how to use Teams, but also the back end of it as well, and being able to monitor and also have the ability to go forward as and when new Teams services come to life within Microsoft Teams. But also things around the change management campaigns, around just how to kind of change the thinking from a traditional IT perspective to the modern way of kind of rolling out features or services and making sure that communication is always kind of part of that. Even if it was a simple email, which is what they kind of used, then that was it before they go into a smarter way of releasing the communications to the users. And then you have the other areas around the pilot groups and the early adopters, essentially making them responsible to understand what kind of things are quick wins, as well as the kind of bigger works that we could plan for future in order to roll out. So we kind of used this approach for that, and then being able to get to the point where, from a migration perspective, being able to migrate the Skype for Business users into Microsoft Teams and then retiring. So there'll be more detail a bit later on that. But broadly speaking, this was roughly the timeline we kind of used. So from an IT point of view, as well as the end user perspective, the journey looks something along these lines, whereby, main thing is that I had two clients, Teams and Skype for Business, in parallel, and a lot of them were just using Skype for Business as well as third-party systems. But for Teams, they were already using chat, so they already had this deployed on their machines, except that there were not any Microsoft Team chat spaces for them to really collaborate in a specific projects. And that's where we kind of stepped in to try and develop some of those projects, team spaces, and then being able to sort of go forward with Microsoft Teams itself. So there were a number of planning sessions that we had. In particular, I think the training and adoption piece, as well as the governance, were the key ones there. But essentially, the network planning side of things. Now, I'm not a network engineer or even that, to that matter, from an infrastructure perspective. But I know from the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, you can use their the wizard-based network planning tool to at least get as a starter as to what the kind of connectivity may feel like, depending on your number of users and all that kind of information, so which you can feed in. So we kind of went through that as a way to kind of baseline as to how this might work. But in our cases, because we had 10 locations in 10 different countries, a lot of the offices, they were like kind of serviced offices where they had their service office Wi-Fi networks in order to consume with the connections. So they didn't have really their own IT kit as such. So to most of the extent, they were driven by their local service office to Wi-Fi's. From a training adoption and governance, which we look at in more detail, security and compliance was another area, again, from regardless of Microsoft Teams to baseline the entire platform in terms of what policies they should be considering and the ones that should be implementing as well. So we'll look at that a bit later on too. But the main one here was the essentially reduce decline, which was from Skype for Business to Teams. So going through different sessions with the IT team, as well as the legal as well, to understand where the decision lies for them to be able to go through those sessions. So this was quite some time to go through and to come to the decision points for each of these types of sessions. So I kind of managed the Champions Network, so it was quite kind of good to see that the business was willing to adopt Microsoft Teams, and we had kind of around 20 champions signed up to this. So this is 20 against, say, about 500 users. In terms of kind of getting to know with the teams, being our testers, eyes and ears for the business. So very good experience from my perspective. Again, I'm not really a change manager as such. But at least from a driving the adoption perspective, certainly played a good part around that, and being able to host weekly project updates and also showcasing the Microsoft Teams features and some of the scenarios, the tips and tricks and so forth. So that kind of really kept me going for on a weekly basis for that, and being able to also train them on some of the formal training around Teams, but as well as other Microsoft 365 services within that. And really the aim here is that, the champions that, once we have this network, then they kind of stay on to also deliver other services within the teams and also from the Microsoft 365. So essentially the agents for showing the new ways of working, and also being able to field out some of the queries that they may get from their team. So kind of a very good layer for between IT and the business itself. In terms of what did we call it, because there is a lot of jargon, I must say, unless if you happen to be a really Microsoft Teams person, then you know exactly what those things are. These users, they really don't care what technology they use as long as they get their job done. And so, these are the kind of some of the examples you get. What is it I need? Is it a team thing or a group, team side, whatever it is? So we kind of fix that terminology around the fact that we say, we will give you a team workspace that comes with a calendar, conversations, files, the task management, and whether you use it or not, it's there should you need to use it after, say, maybe 2 weeks time or whenever. So that was almost like a package, as we've kind of advertised as a service, that when you ask for Microsoft Teams, then this is what you're going to get. With the right projects that they had, which some of them had obviously the templates and the pages that we built, but really kind of kept it simple in that this is the workspace for collaboration. So in terms of the naming conventions wise, obviously, because when you do look at the naming side of things, and this is some of the suggestions, if you like, from Microsoft's own site as to how you could go about renaming those teams, whether it's a group-based, whether you prefix it with a corporation or whatever it is, you can, your mileage may vary depending on your organization. But what we opted for was that then there is that functional team that spins across the globe, if you like, such as, say, business development or a technical teams. And then you have a specific project in terms of in which country that solo project, for example, operates. So that's how we kind of differentiated as to what each team chat's workspace looks like from a naming perspective. Only that because it's easy to find and also then sort that team in a particular way. So in terms of the types of teams then we had is, we obviously had a number of IT projects, but also the development construction projects. So each of those would get a particular team chat space. And specifically with the development project, they had different templates for their pages, the SharePoint home pages, if you like, within that showing different insights. So we kind of built all that. We didn't use any third-party tools for it, kind of created a Teams template, but we used something that's used in the industry, the Microsoft patterns and practices, PowerShell scripting for SharePoint, in order to generate the SharePoint site and then being able to template that site to be able to fit in the Microsoft Teams. So that's kind of what I used for that. And then obviously for organization level, to work out what type of team would that be. In this case, we proposed that every country gets a Microsoft Teams, but then those org teams base can have anybody coming into it. So we kind of just went with just the one to try it out, and that team was essentially a space to ask questions about Microsoft Teams. So that's an org-wide team we went with, just to sort of see how that plays out before we go further into that organization-based teams. And so the examples of scenarios we had there is the portfolio management with multiple projects. So we had that one big team for that, as well as being able to have the marketing and comms team who work with the graphic designers, exchanging images and other kind of marketing projects and campaigns. So we had various teams around that, including monitoring the agreements for any companies who purchase power from our organizations. If you look at it in a specific ways, some of the scenarios from a team's perspective, then that kind of highlights some of the gains you make in productivity as well as the time-wise. So usually Excel files just gets emailed around, and the way you kind of override that is essentially posting it as a tab, and then therefore anything that's happening with that file is all happening inside the teams. And so this were kind of some of the ways where we kind of just showcased how they can transform their kind of current ways of working with some of these files into how you kind of work within the teams itself. So the engagement was very rich. Really liked the fact that you can do everything inside the teams without having to leave and go to different programs. So that was kind of a big sell for us. And then meeting notes is more about just changing the habits in terms of using OneNote instead of kind of a quick email for meeting minutes and so forth. So we had kind of nuggets of little functionalities such as these in order to kind of adopt and sort of out to other departments in making sure that the Teams is used in these particular ways. So from a governance perspective, this combines both the platform governance, but also Teams and SharePoint too. So kind of going through this, some good websites out there. I think Susan Hanley, for example, is one of them, who has kind of extensive writings around samples of governance, the kind of questions you should consider. But we put together governance, and this could have been in the SharePoint side, but for the small IT team we had, we kind of just put together to begin with as a document that kind of sets out the clear processes around who gets the teams, who can provision it, as well as being able to go through the actual workshop elements of it in terms of making sure the team is trained, and also the major part of it is the policies for teams, meetings, and so on. So again, governance sessions can a session of its own, but that's kind of what we went through in the sense that from day one, just have to make sure that you got your governance in place so that you can manage the service expectations properly. So following on from Microsoft mantra in terms of what do you use for, because the users were already on OneDrive in terms of using it for not just their personal, but also using some of their own department-based files. So kind of setting the message clear that OneDrive is purely for personal and private use, whereas Teams is kind of a focused project work. And then they're, instead of SharePoint, they use another third-party solution. So any collaboration documents that are produced within Teams are then pushed over into this third-party system, and with no real proper integration in place. So it's very much a manual labor, but their third-party system is going to develop some add-ins. So hopefully the Teams integration can fit in with that. So therefore they can shift documents easily once they're into the final version and present it as a knowledge repository. Bit later in this session about security, but in my view, this needs to happen very first, if you like, because it's not just an IT thing. Yes, they can probably do all the training that they have and be able to understand some of the policies, but the key parts here is the legal and the business itself, because without their buying around this, you can deploy Teams as your heart's content, but if some of those policies are not in place, and whilst these discussions kind of go at high level, nobody really takes the accountability unless you had a security officer in the organization. So, in this particular environment where you got the legal and business who are the owners for it to make those decisions. So what we kind of drafted around was that these are the kind of simple, if you like, line by line policies that they can implement, starting to make sure that they secure their Microsoft 365 identities using multi-factor authentication, and then work your way to the devices, whether to allow third-party or bring your own devices, or be able to control what level of operating system that are allowed to connect, all the way into information kind of governance areas of it. So these are the kind of policies kind of put together, so that at least they understand that how bigger of this piece it is. And whilst some of these policies can branch out into multiple scenarios, such as like retention labels, as well as other sensitivity labels you may have, but it kind of really open up their minds that this needs to be done properly, because Microsoft does provide the capability for it, but the organization ultimately is responsible for developing these policies, and also then implement them, and then educate users to adopt. There's the link over there, which is a very good link from Microsoft, which is kind of for a business decision maker. Clearly sets out the exact policies, its implications, as well as its impact on the licenses too. And it kind of just goes through very in a nice order. So do check that out if you can. Very quickly on the external sharing side of things, with Teams, guest access is enabled, and SharePoint has got its own invitation model from an external collaboration perspective, in that you can actually lock down, if you for the SharePoint site, we can still have Teams guest access enabled. So for external collaboration, for us by default, we kind of disable that and only enable that on the team owner's discretion if they wanted to enable that external access, which pretty much happens throughout, I think, for most organizations. But just so you're aware that by default, if you don't do anything on a new tenant, then this is on by default for external collaboration. So those are some of the screenshots you can see with those, the link in there to that takes you through the external sharing settings for that. From our workshops, this was a kind of a template for us that I developed, that for anybody who requires a particular team, I mean, if it's a large team, then essentially we kind of go through the process of making sure that the PowerPoint is set for their particular department, so it's more kind of resonates to them, and then being able to follow up, design the team's workspace for them, play it back to them, and then obviously tweak it if there's any feedback around it. And once we release that team, then we kind of train them up, and then we obviously continue to support them. So in the early days, this kind of happened with some of the projects and departments, just so that we can try out this process. But this doesn't have to happen for every team, but at least we wanted to make sure that Teams is rolled out in such a way that there is enough structured frameworks for the teams to be supported, especially when they rely on Teams to do their business. So this kind of worked for us, a simple approach in order to kind of drive the team's engagement with the business users. A couple of examples around Teams templates. So groups calendar, because a lot of them kind of put their old meetings in their own calendars for meetings and everything else. So we kind of use for every team that we create, there's Office 365 group. So we use that group calendar, and then being able to bring that out into a SharePoint page, and then surface that through into a Teams tab in this particular case. So kind of again for them to engage with their calendar meetings and attend those meetings there. As well as project updates, we use SharePoint news posts, so that it becomes kind of a consistent way to manage project communications for any given project that we have. And these are kind of not custom solutions, is out of the box. Simply use the connectors, point to your respective SharePoint site for pages and calendars, for the site activity and the news posts to be able to bring this out. We didn't use third-party tools to provision Teams. We use PowerShell scripts, which I developed, and obviously then being able to create as and when the request comes in for our Teams. So whilst in the early days we were not expecting hundreds, but certainly in the low numbers is manageable for us. For going forward, we are looking through a kind of a governance tool in order to sort of not just provision the teams, but also being able to manage the teams aspects of processes as well. So things like if somebody starts an organization, then if they want the same role as somebody else, then we would normally have to write a few scripts just to give them access to all the other teams, whereas the tooling might help us. But again, we're kind of early days and just learning the product as we go along before we go into any third-party tools. One of the great benefit you get up until now, even for my previous engagements, I used to develop kind of a SharePoint team site with all the Microsoft training resources. This has been around some time now, but the Microsoft 365 learning pathway, which runs on a SharePoint site, then essentially there is a link there you can actually have a look. It's a simple solution that you can install and enable it in your tenant. And what you essentially get is a Microsoft content, which they look after it on their site, which is on the docs.microsoft.com area. And that actually comes into your own SharePoint site and being able to sort of have all those short videos and step-by-step instructions within that. So for every app, such as all the Office apps, OneDrive, Teams, Yammer, and so on. So all those are laid out nicely. But we actually, kind of configured even further to include our own set of videos, as well as being our own third-party solutions that we've had, their product manuals and steps and everything else. So for us, this was like our main help site in order to get users to drive and understand from a training perspective. We didn't train all the users on Microsoft Teams. We simply didn't have the resource or the budgets around it. So for us, this site proved very useful in order to at least monitor the views that we had and being able to tailor more content as and when we need it. So this was a big plus for us. So from a comms plan perspective, we kind of defined the name of the program. We kind of launched it, advertised on the intranet as well as on the emails to say what this program is about. And the very first stop of that is Microsoft Teams, and then being able to go further into rolling out other services. So there was a kind of a plan laid out what to expect. But also as we went live with Microsoft Teams, then obviously we had a few days, weeks before some of the regular communication updates, but also hosting lunch and learn sessions where I would just basically deliver the Microsoft Teams, what it's about, how it works, and then obviously having the specialist knowledge-based event week sessions in order to tell a customer story from a department, and also having the articles and the poster email campaigns that goes around that just to promote the event as such. And obviously that takes a lot of resources around that, but at least that's the approach that you normally take around that. So kind of a final part around this is the Skype for Business Teams upgrade. For us, this doesn't really prove a challenge. Again, these are the steps you get from Microsoft. So we just basically took this plan, tailored it to our needs in terms of how we roll that out. And for us, it was a big bang approach for taking users from Skype to Teams. From a communications perspective, for us, the one key difference was the collaboration between Teams and Skype for Business. So from that point of view, it was a simple communication for us to say that we're going to switch this off after we tried it out with the champions, which was successful, that the experience that they saw was seamless. And then on the day when we went live with Teams, we switched over there Skype for Business to Teams. We didn't have a calling plan as such, so there was no complexity around it, but that would have been a different approach if we had done this switchover. So for us, it was a win from getting rid of Skype for Business. So there's the screenshots there that you get the seamless experience from the notifications, and then literally just start using it from within the Teams only mode, coming from the Islands mode that you have. And it's the one switch within the admin center to do that. So adoption is growing, albeit less users, but the trend is definitely upwards, and which is good. So this is for us continually monitoring it. And then going forward, we're seeing more requests coming in, such as shifts and other types of services. So for us, this is a simple process that we follow within the IT to say, take everything that comes across. If it's something large, then we have a business case for it, subject to approvals. Then we obviously review that in the grand scheme of things before we recommend a solution and then decide to implement it. So kind of very important when you work with teams, because it does relate with other Microsoft. At the moment, we kind of create the teams within the IT, but going forward, we're going to relax that control, because any user should be able to create Microsoft Teams as long as IT or any owner of the service can monitor how they're getting on with Teams. So instead of disabling from start, it's better to disable it afterwards once you've had that feedback from the users, whether they're using it properly or not, and so on. So we're kind of looking into that, as well as exploring the intranets and Yammer and everything else with that, so that we can bring in that whole collaboration experience together and not just Teams. Okay, so much of what I've kind of said, all the links, everything else comes from this slide here. And obviously, the one that I like over here is the live success demo that you can get within that time. So, do check that out if you have access to it, and from a user's perspective. But yeah, a lot of it, we found it straightforward to do it, but obviously there are some challenges around working with the business, as well as being able to drive some of those engagements that you have. So with that, thanks very much. That was a lot of slides, but hopefully they'll be made available to you so that you could kind of go and revisit them. But from my point of view, I'd just like to say thank you and the organizers and TeamFest 2020 for making it happen. And when you get a chance, please do fill out the quick form for the feedback. And so, yeah, enjoy the keynotes coming up at 5 o'clock. Until then, thanks very much.